The prairie wind carried with it the faint scent of rain, though the sky above remained stubbornly clear. Nathaniel Cole stood on the porch of his ranch house, his calloused hands gripping the rail as he scanned the horizon. At 31, he had built this land from little more than sweat and stubbornness, but the silence pressed heavier with each season. Cattle moved slowly in the distance, their shapes shifting like shadows in the evening light, and for a fleeting moment he wondered if his life would always be measured in harvests, debts, and the endless creak of an empty house. 2 weeks earlier, he had sent a letter carefully worded, respectfully sealed, requesting a bride from the Lawson family, whose reputation was as solid as oak. They were known across the territory for their successful trading business and for their three accomplished daughters, each praised in church pews and town squares for beauty and grace. Nathaniel had not asked for beauty. He had asked for a partner, someone steady enough to face the loneliness of ranch life, strong enough to endure both drought and winter storm. Still, when the reply came swiftly promising a bride within the month, he had felt the kind of hope that both warms and unsettles a man. Now, as the days shortened and dusk fell faster with each evening, he found himself restless. The letter had named his future wife Eliza Lawson. He remembered her faintly, a young woman he had seen once at a county fair, standing behind her sisters like a shadow no one cared to notice. While the older girls had drawn admirers with their laughter and fine dresses, Eliza had been the one carrying parcels, quiet and unsmiling, her plain features barely worth remark. Yet Nathaniel remembered something else, though he had not spoken of it to anyone. He remembered the way she had slipped food from her own plate to a hungry child lingering near the fairground fence. No one else had seen, but Nathaniel had, and the memory lingered. The wagon bringing her was due to arrive tomorrow by noon. Nathaniel had spent the morning scrubbing floors, changing linens, and arranging flowers in a chipped vase he'd found among his mother's old belongings. He told himself it was for appearance's sake, but he knew it was more than that. A man did not polish silver he never used unless he hoped to impress. What Nathaniel did not know was what had unfolded in the Lawson household when his letter arrived. For the Lawsons, wealthy in reputation, but stretched thin by debts, the proposal had seemed an opportunity too convenient to ignore. Their eldest daughters, admired and envied, had prospects far more advantageous than marriage to a solitary rancher. And so, with whispered relief and quiet laughter, they chose Eliza, the youngest, the daughter who had always been considered more burden than blessing. "It is perfect," Mrs. Lawson had said with a smile sharp as glass. "She will be his problem now." Eliza had overheard enough of those words to understand. She had always understood, even as a child, when affection was measured and rarely offered to her. She was too blunt, her mother said, too plain, too serious, too unwilling to simper at the right moments. What others called honesty, her family called obstinacy. And so when her father informed her of the arrangement, she had simply bowed her head as though resignation might protect the last fragile threads of dignity she still clung to. That night, Eliza sat by the narrow window of her small room, the moonlight falling across the worn trunk that now held her belongings. She thought of the rancher whose name she barely knew. Nathaniel Cole, a man spoken of as hard-working, solitary, respectable. She wondered if he remembered the girl from the fair who gave bread to a child. She doubted it. Men noticed beauty and charm, not small kindnesses carried out in shadows. Yet as she listened to her sister's laughter drifting from the parlor below, she allowed herself one fragile hope that perhaps far from home she might finally be seen not as an embarrassment, but as something more. When morning came, the house stirred with unusual activity. Her sisters watched from the doorway as Eliza's trunk was loaded onto the wagon, their expressions polished into masks of false sweetness. "Write to us," one of them said, though her tone carried no sincerity. Their mother pressed a cool kiss to her cheek, a gesture so foreign it left Eliza more unsettled than comforted. Her father's farewell was brisk, a nod more suited to closing a business deal than sending off a daughter. The driver clicked his tongue, and the horses lurched forward. Eliza did not look back. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the road ahead, where dust rose like smoke beneath the wheels. Each mile carried her farther from the life she had always known, a life of whispered disapproval and silent meals. Yet each mile also carried her closer to a future unwritten. She did not know whether Nathaniel Cole was a kind man or merely another jailer wearing a different face. But she resolved that if she must step into this new life, she would do so with her eyes open, her heart guarded, and her voice unafraid. By late afternoon, the wagon reached the edge of Nathaniel's land. The fields stretched wide beneath the autumn sun, golden with the remnants of harvest, the fences straight and sturdy, the house standing proud against the endless sky. Eliza felt a nervous flutter in her stomach as the driver reined in the horses. The figure on the porch, straight and tall and broad-shouldered, his hat shadowing a face weathered by work and sun. Nathaniel stepped forward as the wagon came to a halt. His movements were measured, deliberate, as though he had rehearsed them in his mind. When he reached the side of the wagon, he extended a hand. Eliza hesitated only a moment before placing her own in his. His grip was firm but not crushing, his palm rough but warm. For the first time in years, she felt steadied rather than pushed aside. "Miss Lawson," he said, his voice low, carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to silence. "Mr. Cole," she replied, meeting his eyes with more courage than she felt. And in that instant, before the trunk was lifted down, before the doorway of his home opened to her, before a word of their future was spoken, both of them sensed, without yet understanding, that something had shifted. Not the cruel bargain her family believed, nor the practical arrangement Nathaniel had requested, but the beginning of something neither had expected, the fragile spark of recognition of two lives about to change forever. Inside the ranch house, the air was warmer than Eliza expected. Not just from the fire burning in the stone hearth, but from the way the space had been cared for. The furniture was sturdy rather than elegant, the shelves lined with well-worn books, and a quilt folded neatly across the back of the settee. It was the kind of room built for living, not for show. For a moment she simply stood there, her trunk resting by the door, trying to remember the last time a house had felt like a place of comfort rather than a stage where she was meant to perform a role she never wanted. Nathaniel cleared his throat softly and gestured toward the kitchen. "I've stew on the stove and bread just out of the oven. The ride must have left you tired. You'll want a meal before you settle in." She nodded, though her voice caught when she tried to thank him. The wagon journey had left her stiff and hungry, yet she had grown so used to enduring without complaint that it felt strange to have her needs anticipated. She followed him into the kitchen, her eyes tracing the simple order of the space copper pans, hanging neatly on hooks, a long wooden table polished by use herbs, drying from a beam overhead. Nathaniel moved with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to providing for himself. He ladled the thick stew into bowls, the scent of beef and root vegetables rising with the steam, and sliced bread with quick, steady motions. When he set the meal before her, Eliza felt a flicker of unease at the careful courtesy. Courtesy in her childhood home had always been a mask worn before guests, never extended to her in private. She lowered her gaze, wary of reading too much into such small kindness. They ate mostly in silence, the crackle of the fire filling the spaces between clinks of spoon against bowl. Yet Eliza could feel his eyes on her from time to time, not with the cold appraisal she had endured from others, but with a searching curiosity, as though he were piecing together a puzzle. Finally, he set down his spoon. "Your family spoke of you in their letter," he said, his tone even. Eliza stiffened. "Did they? They said you were practical." He leaned back, slightly studying her reaction. The word fell between them like a stone. Practical, her mother's favorite dismissal. Plain, dull, lacking charm. Eliza forced herself to meet his gaze. "That's one way to say it." Nathaniel's mouth curved faintly, though his eyes remained steady. "I remember something different. At the county fair 3 years ago, you gave food to a hungry boy when no one else noticed." Heat rose in her cheeks before she could stop it. She had never spoken of that moment to anyone. It had felt too small, too ordinary to matter. "You remember that?" "I do," Nathaniel said simply. "I remember thinking it told me more about you than any reputation or family word ever could." For the first time since she had left her father's house, Eliza felt a knot inside her begin to loosen. To be remembered for something other than her supposed flaws unsettled her, but it also kindled a fragile spark of possibility. Later, when Nathaniel showed her to the small bedroom prepared at the back of the house, Eliza paused at the threshold. The linen smelled faintly of lavender, and a vase of wildflowers stood on the table by the window. She traced the edge of the quilt with her fingers, unsure how to voice the gratitude she felt. Words failed her, so she merely turned and offered him a quiet nod. "Rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow we'll rise early. I'd like to show you the land in the morning light." She lay awake longer than she intended, the firelight flickering softly across the walls. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of voices calling her burdened mistake unworthy. Yet each time she woke, she heard only the hush of the prairie wind outside, and the steady rhythm of silence that was not hostile, only vast. At dawn, she rose and dressed, fastening her hair with trembling hands. When she stepped into the kitchen, Nathaniel was already there, pouring steaming coffee into 2 cups. His hair was slightly mussed, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, and Eliza felt a strange twist in her chest at the unguarded sight. "Coffee?" he asked. "Yes, please." The warmth of the cup against her palm steadied her. She took a sip, surprised by how strong it was, how bracing. He cracked eggs into a pan, speaking over the sizzle. "You don't have to keep my hours. Ranch work begins before sunrise, but I don't expect you to carry my burdens." Eliza watched him, her brow furrowing. "Then why bring me here, Mr. Cole? What exactly do you hope to gain from this marriage?" "Call me Nathaniel," he said. His eyes flickered toward her before settling back on the pan. "And that's a fair question. I've spent years building this place, Landstock House, but it's been a lonely task. I thought perhaps it was time to share it with someone." "Lonely enough to marry a stranger?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. His answer was quiet but firm. "Maybe. Or maybe I was hoping she wouldn't remain a stranger for long." Her chest tightened at the honesty in his tone. She had expected calculation, some hidden bargain to explain why a prosperous rancher would settle for the daughter her family treated as disposable. Instead, she found sincerity, unadorned and steady. They ate together at the table, the eggs and bread, simple but filling. Nathaniel barely touched his food, watching her instead, as though her presence itself was something unfamiliar he was still learning how to hold. After a long silence, he leaned forward. "When I helped you down from the wagon yesterday, you looked at me like a woman deciding whether I could be trusted. Am I right?" Eliza froze, her fork poised above her plate. The question struck too close to truth she had buried deep. She lowered her gaze. "I've learned that trust should not be given freely." "And what do you think I want from you?" he asked. Her eyes lifted to his, drawn despite herself. She found not hunger or calculation, but curiosity edged with something, gentler hope perhaps. She swallowed hard. "I don't know yet, but I don't think it's what my family promised you." Nathaniel reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The touch was warm, calloused, unexpectedly gentle. "What if I told you all I want is honesty? Someone who will speak truth, even when it cuts. Someone who sees the world as it is." Her breath caught. Those very traits had been branded her flaws, her failings, her shame. Yet here they were being named as virtues. She felt a tremor of fear and relief all at once, as though a door she had long assumed locked was quietly opening before her. She closed her eyes, briefly steadying herself. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "you made a better choice than you realize." They walked the pasture after breakfast, the grass still jeweled with dew, their breath showing in faint wisps that the sun would soon erase. Meadowlarks stitched bright notes across the quiet, and a line of cottonwoods marked the draw, where a thread of water ran even in dry months. Nathaniel moved with the unthinking assurance of a man who knew every fence post, every gate, latch, every hollow where cattle liked to bed down in the heat. Eliza matched his stride without crowding it. Her skirts gathered neatly in one hand, her eyes roaming like a cartographer's taking measure of a country she might one day call her own. "That ridge," Nathaniel said, nodding toward a long-backed rise against the western sky, "breaks the worst of the wind. In winter, we push the herd beneath it and feed from the north hay." "It's orderly," she said, surprised it came out as praise. "You've planned for things not going to plan." He glanced sideways, a sliver of amusement in his eyes. "Hard lesson learned. The first bad winter taught me that hope is not a strategy." They reached a gate, and he lifted the chain holding the panel for her. She stepped through, her gaze catching on a small figure. In the shade of a hackberry, a calf tucked tight to the ground, its flank rising fast, too fast. The mother stood over it, tail flicking, ears pricked. Eliza stopped. "That one's off," she murmured. Nathaniel followed her line of sight, then nodded. "Good eye." He whistled a soft, coaxing sound and slipped through the fence with the ease of long practice. Eliza didn't ask permission. She paced the outside of the wire until she found the end post and slipped through the wider gap. The cow swung her head but didn't step, uncertain whether to challenge or trust. Nathaniel moved to the calf's shoulder, hands slow, steady, the way a man speaks to frightened creatures without words. "Here," Eliza said, kneeling opposite him, unpinning the small bronze brooch at her collar. She slid it beneath the rawhide lariat Nathaniel had looped around the calf's foreleg and used the brooch like a clasp to tighten and hold without cutting. "Won't bite as hard as a knot," she explained. He arched a brow, impressed despite himself. "You've done this." "With lambs," she said. The Hendersons kept a few when I was younger, until they went to cattle and swore never to wrestle a newborn again. They worked without speaking, Nathaniel lifting the calf's leg to examine a swollen pastern. Eliza easing the tail aside to check for swelling along the belly and signs of scours. Up close, she could see the calf's eyes were bright, not dull pain, not fever. She glanced at the mother who had settled into a wary stillness watching. Twisted in a prairie dog hole, Nathaniel said at last. Swollen. We'll cool it. He handed Eliza a canteen. She soaked her kerchief and wrung it out until it didn't drip, then wrapped the wet cloth around the joint, the coolness blanching the skin beneath. The calf bawled once loud and offended, then stilled. Give him a minute, she said softly. Then we'll see if he'll take the teat. Nathaniel sat back on his heels and looked at her, not at her plain dress or the way a strand of hair had worked loose in the breeze, but at the calm competence in her hands. The prairie was hard on anything fragile. It did not tolerate pretense. He found himself grateful against his own expectations that Eliza had arrived with a steadiness honed by hard places. When they rose, the calf rose with them stumbling but standing, the mother pressing her muzzle against its flank, urging it on. Eliza dusted her palms on her skirt, leaving pale streaks. Nathaniel noticed and reached for his handkerchief, offering it without comment. She took it and smiled small and genuine. They walked on toward the creek where willows scribbled green lines against the bank. A faint ribbon of water murmured over stones. Eliza crouched and dipped her fingers in the cold, a shock that made her breath catch and then steady. May I ask you something, she said without looking up. You may. When you wrote to my father, why my family? He took longer than politeness required to answer. The croak of a frog filled the pause, absurd and somehow anchoring. Because 3 years ago at the fair, I went asking about the Lawsons after I saw you feed that boy. I wanted to know if what I'd seen was habit or accident. And what did you hear? That your family is clever, he said evenly. Good at trading, good at looking good, and that you weren't like the others. He picked up a small stone and turned it in his palm. I also heard talk about certain deals that left other folks the worse for wear. Nothing a judge could touch, but nothing I'd be proud of. She stood slowly brushing willow shade from her skirt. The wind lifted the fine hairs at her temple. So you chose me because you wanted a window into their dealings. I thought I did, he said, meeting her gaze now, not flinching. For a while I told myself a marriage could be a partnership of practical benefits. Land needs alliances. He exhaled. Then your wagon came over the ridge, and you looked at me like you would measure me by what I did not, what I said. And I realized I'd set my sights too low. Something uncoiled in her chest that she hadn't realized was braced anger, yes, but also relief that he would say it plainly. I won't be used, she said no, heat in it only truth. I know, he answered, and I won't use you. If you tell me something about your family one day, it will be because it matters to you, not because I asked for it. He let the stone fall. I asked for a wife out of loneliness. I am beginning to want a wife out of respect. They stood with the creek's murmur between them, the declaration hanging like a bridge they could choose to cross or refuse. Eliza looked down at their shadows braided on the water and felt the old ache of being overlooked recede by inches. From the far pasture, a shout tore the quiet. Nathaniel's head snapped up. Gate, he called, already moving. If that north panel's down, the herd will be in the oats, and then God help us. They ran. Eliza gathered her skirts and kept pace, the earth thrumming beneath their feet, the world narrowing to the line of fence ahead, where 2 ranch hands were waving the gate, listing drunkenly from its hinges. A knot of cattle pressed against the opening, curious and opportunistic noses, high eyes bright with mischief. Take the post, Nathaniel shouted, skidding to a stop at the corner brace. He slammed his shoulder under the sagging panel and heaved. Eliza threw her weight against the end post boots, digging for purchase palms, burning where splinters found skin. The gate rose an inch, then 2. One of the hands shoved a new pin through the hinge, while the other cracked a whip in the dirt to turn the lid heifer. The cattle wavered, then flowed away along the fence, as if the notion had never occurred to them. When the last head drifted off, Nathaniel eased the gate into place. He looked at Eliza, hair wild now, face flushed, breathing hard, and grinned boyish and sudden. You're hired, he said, and for a dizzy second she felt the laugh gather in her throat like a bird. They walked back slower, the crisis past, the day burned cleaner by effort. Near the house the wind shifted, and she smelled rain for the first time in earnest, not the wish of it. Cloud piled over the ridge, purple-bellied and muscled, the kind of storm that made the world hold its breath. "We'll need to bring the horses in," Nathaniel said. "Storm like that will spook the sorrel and send him through a fence." "I can halt her," she offered. He nodded once, not testing, just accepting. They worked side by side in the dim of the stable as the sky went bruised dark. The horses blew and danced at the edges of their ropes, ears flicking toward the thunder's far drum. Eliza spoke to them low and steady, the way she had to frighten children when mothers were too harried to soothe. One by one they settled. Nathaniel watched the change ripple through the string, saw how the bay's white-rimmed eyes softened when Eliza laid a firm palm on his neck. When the first fat drops hit the roof, the scent of rain rose like a hymn. They stood in the doorway and watched the pasture turn, mottled the dust, surrendering in splotches, the world sharpening under the blessing of water. "I thought storms were only something to fear," Eliza said. "They can be," he answered. "But they also green the world. Sometimes breaking is how the land remembers to grow." She turned that over the way a good line wants a second reading. And people, he took a breath, rain cooled and clean. "I'm learning they're not so different." The downpour thickened, silver cords stitched tight between roof and earth. They stepped back as the wind threw mist into the doorway, standing close only because the space demanded it. Eliza felt the heat of him at her shoulder, the steadiness of his presence, and for once it did not jar the raw places in her. It softened them. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For what?" "For saying what you meant at the creek. For not dressing it up." He nodded, and it struck her that his silences were not evasions, but careful rooms where truth could sit without being crowded. "You deserve plain speaking," he said. "I may be slow to it at times, but I'll try." "Then I'll answer in kind," she said, pulse loud as the rain. "I was sent because I asked the wrong questions at home, questions about money that arrived too neatly and favors that cost someone else their roof. If anyone comes asking after me or threatening you on account of me, I won't hide behind your name. My name is yours if you want it," he said quietly, "but I won't use it to hide you either. If trouble comes, we'll face it standing up." A flash split the sky, the thunder's crack, rolling over them like a wave. Without thinking, Eliza's hand found the edge of his sleeve, not clutching, only anchoring. He didn't move away. When the worst had passed and the rain fell to a steady hush, Nathaniel fetched 2 mugs and filled them with coffee gone lukewarm on the stove. They drank it anyway, leaning against the stable wall, watching the world rinse itself clean. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll take you to the north pasture. There's a stand of wild plums that somehow survives the deer. They're tart yet." And after she asked, after he said, and the word held a breath that surprised them both, "We'll set a rhythm that suits us." She finished her coffee and looked out at the brightening day. The storm had left everything sharp-edged, honest. She could see farther. She could breathe deeper. And in the space the rain had cleared, she felt the strange, solid weight of a decision forming, not about compliance, but about choosing. "Very well," she said. "Let's see what grows." The following morning dawned clear, the air scrubbed sharp by the night storm. Sunlight spilled over the prairie in molten streams, catching in the rain-beaded grasses until the land itself seemed stitched with silver. Eliza stepped from the house, drawing her shawl tight around her shoulders, and let the breath of the earth fill her chest. The storm had left a kind of newness she could not name, as if every fence and stone were waiting for its story to be rewritten. Nathaniel was already at the corral, his hat brim casting shade across his eyes as he checked the latches. He looked up when she approached, his expression brightening in a way that startled her. Men in her life had often looked at her with calculation, with amusement, with irritation, but seldom with this quiet gladness, as if her presence alone steadied something in him. "North pasture today," he said. "We'll ride. Best way to cover the ground." Her pulse quickened at the thought. She had ridden before, of course. Her father insisted every Lawson child know their seat, but never without a sister laughing at her posture, never without her mother's cool eyes marking every misstep. To ride here with no audience but open sky felt like a chance to reclaim the thing itself. Nathaniel saddled a chestnut mare for her, steady and broad-backed. He adjusted the stirrups without comment, his hands efficient, respectful. When she swung into the saddle, the mare shifted but did not resist. Nathaniel mounted his gray gelding and clicked his tongue, and together they moved out across the wet fields, hooves striking sparks of water from the grass. The land opened in a sweep of ridges and low draws, a country both severe and generous. They rode in companionable silence, at first the only sound the creak of leather and the rhythmic fall of hooves. Then Nathaniel spoke, his voice carrying in the clear air. My father used to say the prairie teaches you three things: if you stay long enough, patience, humility, and how small you really are. Eliza smiled faintly. Did you believe him? Not then. I was too busy trying to prove I was bigger than all of it. But when the blizzards came, and when the droughts followed, I learned otherwise. They topped a ridge and paused, looking down on a scatter of cattle grazing in the hollow below. Beyond a line of plum trees hunched together, their branches dark against the brightened grass. Nathaniel gestured toward them. That's where we're headed. They'll be ripe in a week or two. I'll show you how to gather before the deer strip them. They rode down the grass, whispering against their boots. At the trees, Eliza swung down first, brushing her hand across a branch heavy with small green fruit. She plucked one bit carefully and winced at the sourness. Nathaniel laughed under his breath. I warned you. But it tastes alive, she said, surprising herself. Like it hasn't learned to hide what it is. His laughter faded into something quieter. That's a rare gift to name things as they are, and not look away. Eliza turned the plum pit in her hand and met his eyes. It was never a gift to my family. It was a nuisance. Nathaniel leaned against his gelding's shoulder, arms crossed. Maybe to them. But here I could use someone unafraid of truth. A ranch doesn't thrive on wishful thinking. Neither does a marriage. The word hung there, marriage, heavier than any saddle, heavier even than the sky. Eliza felt the world tilt slightly. She had come here under orders delivered like cargo told to accept her lot with meek gratitude. Yet standing beneath these rough plum trees, their branches already promising sweetness, she sensed the outlines of a different future. One not handed to her, but chosen. She dropped the pit into the grass. I won't pretend to be what I'm not, she said. Good, Nathaniel replied. I wouldn't believe you if you tried. They ate a simple lunch in the shade, bread and cheese Nathaniel had packed in a cloth. He poured water from a flask, and she drank deeply, the coolness washing the last sour plum from her mouth. Around them, cattle moved with slow certainty, tails flicking, heads bowed to graze. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was not empty, but alive, filled with the murmur of insects, the creak of tree branches, the soft tearing of grass. Eliza realized she was not waiting for judgment or scorn, not rehearsing defenses in her head. She was simply there, present her own company enough and his company welcome. At length, Nathaniel said, You carry a weight, more than most. She traced a groove in the bark of the tree with her finger. When you speak truth where others prefer lies, the weight comes whether you want it or not. He studied her, his gaze steady but not prying. If you choose, you can set some of it down here. Her throat tightened. She looked away toward the horizon where clouds gathered again, white and towering. Perhaps. But setting it down doesn't mean it disappears. No, he agreed. But maybe it means you don't have to carry it alone. Something shifted, then subtle as a change in the wind. For the first time since leaving her family's house, Eliza felt the possibility of belonging without condition. The thought scared her as much as it comforted her. They rode back slowly, the sun angling west, throwing long shadows across the land. By the time they reached the barn, the sky burned copper and rose the air rich with the scent of earth, still damp from last night's rain. Nathaniel dismounted and helped her down, his hand, steady at her waist just long enough for her to notice the steadiness itself. Thank you, she said. For what? For today. For not filling the silence with words meant to impress. He smiled, small but real. Silence is where the truth does its work. That night, as she lay beneath the quilt in the small bedroom, Eliza stared at the ceiling beams and listened to the house settling into quiet. For the first time, she did not dread what tomorrow would bring. For the first time, she thought of tomorrow as something she might shape rather than something done to her. And outside, the prairie stretched endless and waiting as if the land itself approved. They rode into town 2 days later for salt nails, and the kind of small things a ranch always runs out of at the worst time. Morning light threw a shine on every hitch rail and window pane after the rains, and the road held last night's puddles like tarnished mirrors. Eliza sat straight-backed on the chestnut, not stiff with pride, but with a careful calm earned by years of giving nothing to the wrong eyes. Nathaniel kept to her left, a quiet presence, the gray gelding flicking an ear with each new sound. Hill's Mercantile smelled of coffee leather and the sweet dust of flour sacks. Mrs. Hill had a way of sorting customers in a glance and deciding whether they'd cost her time. She looked them over and softened a fraction. "Mr. Cole," she said then to Eliza, "and you must be Mrs." The pause hung. Eliza felt a catch on the open air between them. "Lawson for the moment," Eliza said steady. "Eliza, we're arranging legalities next month, but the work's begun already." Mrs. Hill's mouth tightened approval that she hid out of habit. "Well, Eliza, you'll want the good needles if you mean to mend for men. The cheap ones snap and curse the house." She moved along the counter, pulling items with a competence that brooked no argument. Eliza felt something unclasp inside at the simple respect of being addressed by name and necessity. They were sorting ledgers and a coil of wire when the shop bell rasped. The voice that followed was polished enough to scrape. "Cole, I figured your kind would run your business with a handshake and a hope." Nathaniel did not turn immediately. He finished adding figures and closed the notebook with care. Then he faced the man in the doorway, a tall shape in a city-cut coat, a hat too fine for the weather, a smile edged like a blade. "Pike," Nathaniel said, "I thought you'd run your tongue smoother when you crossed the county line." Eliza saw how Mrs. Hill's hands went still. Outside, the shopkeeper murmured more prayer than suggestion. They stepped into the glare. Dust hung bright in the street. Harness metal flashed. Pike followed his boots too clean, his eyes sliding to Eliza and back with a practiced glance that dismissed and measured in the same breath. "Wesley Pike," he said to her, tipping his hat. "I represent certain interests that have taken a charitable view of the Lawson family's liquidity." He produced a paper from inside his coat with theatrical distaste. "There are notes due, arrangements agreed upon. The Lawsons have offered, shall we say, consideration." His smile cupped cruelty. A daughter provided for at last. Nathaniel took the paper and read without changing face. Eliza watched the long vein at his temple stand, then smooth. He folded the sheet and slid it back. "Your paper has nothing to do with me," he said. Pike's gaze flicked to Eliza again, this time lingering. "On the contrary, the consideration travels with the property. If Miss Lawson is to be made a wife, the dowry, such as it is, binds your ranch's fortunes to certain obligations." Eliza did not mean for the laugh to rise, but it did a sound without humor. "They didn't send a dowry," she said. "They sent me." Pike's teeth showed. "Precisely. A living promissory note. Pretty innovation, isn't it? A gentleman in St. Louis will be thrilled to see how the frontier keeps pace with modern finance." The words made the street tilt. The insult wasn't in the implication Eliza was long inured to being bartered, but in the neatness of the trap. Bind the rancher to the family he might have hoped to escape bleed him by law while pretending it was marriage. She could feel the old shame try to claim her, the reflex that told her to swallow and say nothing. Nathaniel spoke before the silence hardened. "You're saying the Lawsons pledged their daughter as security for a debt they never meant to pay?" he said softly, as if tasting poison to learn its flavor. "I'm saying," Pike answered, "my principles prefer resolution to scandal. You send Miss Lawson back with a signed understanding regarding the Morrison parcel and certain mineral rights near Elk Draw, the note will disappear. Otherwise," he gestured with his hat toward the courthouse 2 doors down. "We let the law work in the light." Mrs. Hill had come to the threshold, jaw set. 2 ranch hands across the street paused mid-load. News traveled like a grass fire in a town with not enough water to spare. Eliza felt the moment descend clear and cold. She turned so Pike could not miss a word. "Tell your principals the Lawsons' notes are built on false ledgers and favors traded in back rooms. Tell them the money that bought their fine coats came from men who woke to find their land fenced and their wells fenced again. Tell them I won't be returned like a faulty tool to keep their secrets tidy." Pike's amusement curdled. "The law will not be moved by your little sermons." "Then let's move it with receipts," she said, meeting his eyes. "I kept copies, dates, amounts, names of men who cannot hold their drink and talk too much when they try. Bring your light." He blinked 1 beat too slow. It was the first honest expression she had seen on his face, a flinch where certainty should have stood. He turned his attention back to Nathaniel with renewed calculation. "You may find your bride more expensive than a herd of breeding cows, Mr. Cole." Nathaniel's voice came quiet as a hammer set true. "I'd have found a herd cheaper than regret." He stepped a fraction closer, not menace, only measure. "You're going to leave now. If you come again, bring every paper you intend to waive, because you won't get a second chance to arrange them." Pike tipped his hat in a motion that meant nothing in everything. 3 days, he said. "Then I file." He turned on a heel too polished for local dust and walked away, his coat unmarked by the street's contempt. The talk began before he reached the end of the block. Mrs. Hill moved first, shooing it away like flies. "Back to your business," she called to the gawkers. To Eliza Lower, "You come inside." They finished their purchases with fewer words. When they mounted, Nathaniel did not offer the usual courtesies. He handed Eliza the gray's reins and took the chestnut himself, a silent admission of his need to watch the trail behind. They rode out without hurry, the better to look like people with nothing to hide, and kept to the creek bed's shade until the town sunk behind a low rise, and the prairie opened like a book that would tell the truth if you asked it right. Only then did Nathaniel speak. "You kept copies, not a question." "I did." She tightened the gray's cinch and checked the bit motion. Her body knew better than thought. "Not out of spite. Out of insurance against the day truth would be the only thing left between me and ruin." "You'll show me." "Yes," she said, "but not because you ask. Because if your name is to be tied to mine, I want you to know what knot you're tying." They reached the ranch with the sun tilting west. Nathaniel unsaddled in silence, then followed Eliza to the small bedroom. She knelt by the trunk, lifted the false bottom with the same care she'd used on the calf's leg, and brought out a wrapped bundle. Inside lay thin papers, edges nicked by handling. The ink bled where rain had once come through a roof. Dates, endorsements, a draft that should have been accounted for twice but had been accounted for none. A list of parcels whose lines had shifted between maps. Nathaniel read standing because the truth deserved a man on his feet. He asked few questions. The answers were largely there if you had eyes and a willingness to blister your conscience. When he finished, he eased the papers back into her keeping, rather than taking them for his own. "They will come hard," he said. "Maybe with deputies who don't ask to see the grain behind the flour." She nodded. "Then we set our house in order." They did not with bravado, but with method. Nathaniel rode to his nearest neighbor under the pretext of borrowing a branding iron and returned with the kind of wordless solidarity that lives west of law. Eliza copied her notes clean on foolscap. 3 sets of the script even as fence wire. 1 bundle went into the cook stove's ash pan wrapped in oilcloth. 1 beneath the floorboard under the bed. The 3rd she tucked into the pocket of her riding skirt. Night fell without moon. Coyotes stitched the dark with their sharp thread. Nathaniel lit only 1 lamp in the front room and left the back rooms in shadow. They ate in quiet, not from fear, but from the concentration of people measuring the distance between a threat and its arrival. When he cleared the bowls, Eliza stood and crossed to the shelf where a single photograph leaned, a faded image of a woman with a stubborn mouth and eyes that looked like they found their own weather. "Your mother?" she asked. He glanced up. "Yes. She looks like she would have called things by their names." "She did," he said, "and she paid for it. But the land paid her back in kind." He paused at the doorway, the light cutting the angle of his cheek. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." "I know," she said, surprised by how fully she meant it, "and I won't let you do it for me." "Suits me," he answered. "I don't want a fight I win at the cost of your voice." The next morning dawned too still, the kind of quiet that means the wind is hanging back to watch. By mid-morning, a dust plume lifted on the southern road. Nathaniel stepped onto the porch with the rifle across his forearm, the way a man carries a tool he hopes not to need. Eliza stood inside the doorway, the papers sewn into the lining of her bodice, where a pickpocket would not think to look and a gentleman would not dare. 3 riders came pike in the middle, a deputy on either side. Their horses sweated in the heat. Their hats were the wrong shape to belong here. The deputy on the right had a scar that pulled his mouth into a tilt that would make mercy sit crooked. Pike smiled as if at a private joke. "Good morning, Mr. Cole. Miss Lawson, I do enjoy a prompt appointment." He held up a new paper, the seal red and smug. "By the authority vested, etc., I am to collect the consideration or the sum equivalent. I am an efficient man. I do hope you are too." Eliza stepped forward until the porch's shadow cut a hard line across her boots. "We are very efficient," she said, "and we brought the light you asked for." She lifted her chin toward the empty sky. "Bring your law, then we'll bring the truth." The deputy with the crooked mouth gave a snort, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Hear that Pike lady thinks she's going to school the courthouse." But Pike only smiled, smoothing the edge of his paper, as if the parchment itself were more valuable than the people standing before him. "Truth is what ink says it is, Miss Lawson. Judges don't waste time with feelings." He shifted in the saddle, eyes cold. Now will you ride back with me peaceably, or must I have these good men enforce what the law already expects? Nathaniel stepped off the porch, boots sinking a fraction into damp earth where last night's storm still lingered. His rifle lay easy across his arm, but his voice was steady. You'll not take her anywhere on the strength of paper scribbled by thieves. The deputy bristled, but Pike raised a gloved hand, silencing him. Careful, Cole. You've got land cattle reputation. All can vanish with the right judge's stroke. Don't wager it on a woman who'll only weigh you down. Eliza felt the sting-o words in new mouths, but she stood taller. From the pocket of her skirt, she drew a folded page. Not the originals. Those were hidden. This was one of the clean copies she had made in the lamplight, every number traced with calm purpose. You speak of law, she said. Then let us use it properly. This document records your principal's dealings. The Morrison parcel, the Elk Draw, leases the false signatures. I carry 3 more copies, each entrusted to men of good standing, who will deliver them if I do not return from this encounter. Pike's smile faltered only for an instant, but it was enough. The deputies shifted, suddenly aware this was no longer a simple collection. One muttered a curse low and sharp. You bluff, Pike said, though less certain than before. Do I? Eliza asked. She handed the paper to Nathaniel, who read aloud in the quiet, each name and figure, sharp as a nail driven into wood. Neighbors had begun to gather along the fence line, drawn by the sound of horses and the scent of trouble. Each line Nathaniel spoke carried across the yard to listening ears' ear that would repeat it in town by nightfall. By the time he finished, Pike's composure was cracking. This is theft, he snapped. Private documents. This is truth, Eliza cut in, her voice ringing. And truth travels faster than lies when it's spoken aloud. She looked directly at the deputies. You want to escort me? Then you'll also escort these words to the judge. We'll see if your principals care to answer them in open court. For a long moment, no one moved. The prairie itself seemed to hold its breath. Then the deputy with the scar shifted in his saddle. I didn't sign on to haul women on bad paper, he muttered. He turned his horse, spitting into the dirt again this time, with disgust aimed at Pike. Sort your own mess. The other deputy hesitated, then followed the weight of neighborly eyes, pushing him into retreat. Pike sat alone, the smile gone, the paper in his hand crumpling as his grip tightened. You've made enemies, he hissed. Dangerous ones. Nathaniel took a step closer, his shadow falling long. We already had enemies, Pike. Now they're just honest about it. Pike wheeled his horse, the animal skittering at the sudden pull. Dust rose behind him as he galloped away, a trail of threat left hanging in the morning air. Silence settled, broken only by the distant bawl of cattle. The neighbors began to drift off, muttering, exchanging nods, with Nathaniel glances of respect toward Eliza. A current had shifted. What her family called meddling the prairie had just named courage. Inside, when the door closed behind them, Eliza let her shoulders drop, the strength draining at last. Nathaniel set the rifle aside and came near, not with grand words, but with the simple steadiness that had carried her through since she arrived. You did more than stand your ground, he said. You showed them who you are. Eliza pressed a hand to the folded papers still hidden in her bodice. I've spent years thinking honesty was a curse. Today it felt like a weapon in the right hands. In your hands, he said quietly. Their eyes held the room warm, with the scent of coffee still lingering from breakfast. For the first time in years, Eliza felt the weight she carried shift, not gone, but shared. And in that sharing, it became something new, not burden, but bond. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and waiting. The fight was not finished. Pike would return, and the Lawsons would not surrender their schemes without venom. But for the first time, Eliza believed the truth might not only survive, it might prevail. And in Nathaniel's steady gaze, she saw not the lonely bargain of a rancher, desperate for company, but the beginning of a partnership rooted in something stronger than land or law, a trust hard-earned and all the more unshakable for it. The dust Pike kicked up had barely settled when the first of the neighbors returned, not with questions but with chairs, a loaf of bread, and a carpenter's square. Men who prided themselves on minding their own business had a different definition of own when a bad debt tried to turn a woman into a lien. By noon, a plank table appeared from someone's wagon. By mid-afternoon, a tidy pen of 4-string barbed wire ringed the front gate where none had stood at daybreak. It was the sort of help the prairie offered when it decided you were worth its trouble, unasked, unbilled, and unambiguous. Eliza stood on the porch and watched it happen with the same sense of wonder she had felt at the rain. She looked for the hidden cost, the laugh tucked into a corner, the too friendly hand that would later close like a trap, and found none. When Mrs. Hill herself arrived in a two-wheeled cart with a sack of beans and a coil of stout twine, Eliza nearly lost her composure. The shopkeeper climbed down without ceremony, thrust the goods into Eliza's hands, and tapped her chin with a forefinger. Next time that city weed shows his face, you use your voice like you did today. Your words had more weight than his paper. I had help, Eliza said, glancing at the yard where Nathaniel hammered a brace into a post, his jaw set in its familiar line of concentration. And he had sense, Mrs. Hill replied. Took the shape of your truth and set it where folks could see it. She shaded her eyes and looked square at Eliza. You're a good match if you'll forgive a woman meddling. Eliza felt heat rise under her skin, embarrassed at how much she wanted the words to be true. If the Lawsons make good on their threat, she said it won't be a quiet fight. Then it will be a public one, Mrs. Hill shot back. Pike thrives in corners. We'll drag him to a crossroads. She squeezed Eliza's forearm and went to supervise the stringing of the wire like a general inspecting a fort. At dusk, the men drifted home on the threadbare excuse of chores, leaving behind a yard that looked both more orderly and more watched. Nathaniel washed at the pump, the water darkening the earth at his feet, then came to the porch where Eliza sat with her mending useless stitches, really nothing to repair, but the need to hold something steady in her hands. He leaned against the post, not so near as to presume, not so far as to be mistaken for distant. We should ride in tomorrow, he said. Take your copies to the judge before Pike can choose his courtroom. Eliza set her needle through the fabric and left it there glittering. Do you trust the judge here? As much as a man can, Nathaniel answered. He's straight, but he reads too slow when a fast tongue is talking. We'll bring him paper he can't misread. She nodded. Then we'll put it under the brightest lamp we can find. She drew breath, the words hard and clean as the morning wind. And after whatever comes, let's finish what we began. Make this marriage with our own hands, not as a ledger entry or a defense. Nathaniel's posture changed a fraction, as if a weight he'd long carried had shifted to a place his body knew. He didn't reach for her. He didn't thank her. He only said yes, and the word felt to Eliza like a fence line sinking true on fresh-set posts. They rode at first light. The sky had cleared to a hard enamel blue, and the road to town seemed shorter for being aimed at decision. Eliza wore her riding skirt, and beneath it the papers sewn into the lining. She had debated leaving them in the stove ash or under the floorboard, and decided that if the truth required her to carry it, she would carry it where a thief's hand would burn to touch. Hill's Mercantile stood with its door already propped wide when they passed, and Mrs. Hill raised her chin in a salute that said more than any benediction. Nathaniel tied the gray at the courthouse rail and waited for Eliza to dismount before he set his palm at the small of her back. No claim, only a steadiness shared as they crossed the threshold. The judge kept a tidy chamber that smelled faintly of ink and the sweat of men who had argued themselves into corners. He was spare as a winter tree spectacles, riding low his hair, a bristle of compromise with age. He looked up, frowned at the sight of the rifle that ran casual along Nathaniel's forearm, and nodded anyway at the pair, as one nods to weather that will not be argued with. Mr. Cole, he shifted his attention to Eliza. Miss Lawson, what brings you early? Pike, Nathaniel said, and the name salted the air. The judge's mouth tightened. He came at daybreak with papers I did not like the smell of. Then try these, Eliza said, producing a clean copy from the inner seam of her skirt. She laid it on the desk with the same care she would a newborn lamb. Then the second and third each annotated each date matching the secret records she had kept when the house grew too quiet to pretend you hadn't heard what you heard. The judge read faster than Nathaniel expected, his finger running under lines the way a man checks fence for brakes. Twice he stopped and blew out a breath. Once he reached for a book on the shelf behind him and checked a statute before returning to the page. When he finished, he lifted his gaze and took the measure of Eliza, as if seeing the shape of a person and not just a problem. These, he said, tapping the paper, are testimony. They are not yet proof. They can be made proof, Eliza replied, her voice even. The bank ledgers in town will confirm the transfers. The deed map at the recorder's office will show the line shifts. Ask the clerk who drinks too much at Jenny Ray's if the judge's nephew signed papers he shouldn't have seen and bragged of it after. A corner of the judge's mouth twitched. I'll not take my law from barroom boasts. Then take it from daylight, Nathaniel said. Set a hearing. Call for the ledgers. Put Pike where he can't hire the shadows to talk for him. The judge turned to the door and called for his clerk. Put it on the docket, he ordered when the young man appeared, blinking like a mole in sun. day after tomorrow. And tell Sheriff Briggs I want 2 deputies of my choosing, in the room not any loaned by a man who keeps his ink bottle filled with favors." When the clerk had scuttled away, the judge took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Miss Lawson," he said, "you will not be loved for this." "I am not accustomed to being loved," Eliza answered. She surprised herself by smiling not bitterly, but in acknowledgement of a truth that no longer cut. "I would settle for being believed. Believed is not always safe." "No," she agreed, "but it is right." He put his spectacles back on, and in that small act, the room seemed to right itself like a skiff catching wind. "Day after tomorrow," he repeated. "Come prepared to be made small in the way men make women small when they wish to avoid the size of a sin." "I have learned to stand through smaller rooms," she said. They stepped back into a street that felt different for having named its own trouble. Word flew faster than the gray could trot. By the time they reached the Mercantile, a knot of townspeople had already formed at the corner, tongues wagging but faces sober. Eliza did not slow. She had no wish to be the subject of their speculation, only its instruction that this was not a private grief but a public sickness, and it would be treated in the open. The 2 days between were work, and the work kept panic in its proper place. Nathaniel checked the fence lines and a flank of cows heavy in the bag. Eliza copied a fourth set of papers, because the hand remembers better when it writes twice. At night, they sat at the kitchen table and spoke not of outcomes, but of chores. It was not denial, it was discipline. Hope, they had learned, is a poor plan, but a fine companion when fed sparingly. When the day came, the courtroom filled early ranchers in their cleanest work shirts. A banker who looked as if he had accidentally eaten a lemon Mrs. Hill at the end of a bench with arms crossed like a crowbar, and late Pike oiled and smiling, flanked by a man whose suit cost more than a heifer and smelled like a city's idea of pine. The Lawsons did not appear. Snakes prefer tall grass. Eliza stood when asked and did not fidget under the weight of eyes. She spoke her name, her age, and the dates she remembered, because memory is a ledger too when you keep it without varnish. Pike's lawyer tried to shape her into a story that served his fee. She refused by answering what was asked and nothing more. When he attempted a sneer about a woman's capacity to understand figures, she asked him to repeat the question and then recited the columns in order their sums, the place where the columns broke like a creek bank under flood. A laugh ran around the room and died quickly, embarrassed to be heard where law was trying to stand up. The judge called for the ledgers. He called for the map. He called for the clerk who drank too much, and when the man went purple at his own name, the judge only raised an eyebrow and waited until truth crawled out on its belly and lay panting in the sawdust. The banker tried to retract his memory and found the dates would not move to suit his fear. At last, Pike stood, no smile left to polish. "This is a witch hunt by country folk who fear what they do not understand," he declared, and the word witch hung stale and mean in a room where the only magic present was the stubborn refusal of facts to die. "Sit down, Mr. Pike," the judge said, "or I will find a law that still bites a man for contempt." Pike sat. The room exhaled. The order the judge read was not a blowout, a river tearing its banks. It was a clean channel cut with care. He enjoined Pike and his principals from collecting on the Lawson notes until an audit could be completed. He required the bank to produce records within 10 days. He set a date for a full hearing, and in language that sounded as old as the first fence driven into prairie sod, reminded the room that wives are not collateral and daughters are not chattel, and a court that forgets such things will soon have no authority worth wearing. Outside, the town was brighter for a few minutes, as if the sun had pushed a hand through thin cloud and left it there. People spoke in lower voices. A few came forward to clap Nathaniel's shoulder. More than a few tipped their hats to Eliza, in the old-style respect not chivalry. Mrs. Hill didn't bother with hats. She kissed Eliza's cheek, then Nathaniel's in parody, and announced to no one in particular that she would be putting in a special order for Plum's jars because the wild stand at the north pasture would be bearing within the fortnight. They rode home at a walk, letting the gray choose his footing, not speaking much because the body sometimes needs silence to understand what the heart already knows. At the ridge, they stopped and looked down on the ranch, the line of cottonwoods, the crease of the creek, the barn with its patched roof, the house with the smoke lifting straight in a windless noon. It was not much to a man in St. Louis, perhaps. It was everything to them. At the porch, Nathaniel dismounted and turned hat in his hand, not from uncertainty but from ceremony. "Eliza," he said, and the name sounded like the sum of days. I asked for a wife out of loneliness. I want one now out of respect. Will you make this life with me? Not for shelter, not for law, for the simple reason that it is true. She did not ask him to repeat it. She did not ask him to promise what no man can promise against weather and happenstance. She only answered yes and stepped into his offered hands and then his arms, and then with both feet into the life they would build. They married at month's end, under a sky so clear the stars looked like they had been hammered into place. 2 hands from neighboring spreads stood witness. Mrs. Hill made a cake with sugar she swore she had not been hoarding. The judge came, spectacles shining, and when he spoke the words they sounded like law and mercy in equal measure. Later when the company had gone, and the lamp burned low, Eliza and Nathaniel sat on the porch and listened to the coyotes stitch the edges of the dark. The wind moved in the cottonwoods like a choir caught between verses. Any regrets, he asked, his voice a thread in the warm night. Only that I didn't bring the truth into daylight sooner, she said. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder and added, but then perhaps the daylight wasn't ready. He laughed soft. It is now. She looked out at the land, hard, honest, and good when tended with both hands, and felt the old weight of being unwanted loosen at last. The world would still be a place where men like Pike wore fine hats over thin soles. Storms would still come, and calves would still find prairie dog holes and fences would sag with a season's pull. But she would meet all of it beside a man whose silences made a home for truth and whose words held like well-driven posts. Let's see what grows, she said again, not as a dare this time, but as a blessing. And the prairie patient as ever took the words and laid them down like seed.